Hi, I'm Dr. Ruby Payne, and let me introduce you to the book study with video support that goes with Emotional Poverty Book 2. Those of you that are familiar with Emotional Poverty 1 know that we kind of laid the foundation of basics for emotion. For example, all emotional wellness is about safety and belonging. Now in this book, we're going to take it in more depth. So let me just say a little bit about what's in the book. If you go to the overview, the table of contents, what you will see is the chapters that are in the book. And I'm going to highlight briefly each of those so that you have a sense of what's going to be in the book. The first chapter is about emotional tells, and this is research from the FBI. It looks at how you can tell from the emotional response of a student whether their body is in distress or not, how they pacify themselves, and it's also beneficial and it helps you know sometimes when you're getting the truth and when you're not. Chapter 2 looks at this whole thing around your brain, your prefrontal cortex. What we know is that during adolescence, the brain, after you go through puberty, it reorganizes itself from the back to the front. And one of the things that happens is the prefrontal cortex is the last to develop, and in males it develops about 2 years behind females. And in this chapter, we look specifically at ADHD, which is a prefrontal cortex issue, and it's a lot of times based on physical issues in the brain. And we're going to look at anxiety. Anxiety can come out of both the prefrontal cortex or the amygdala. And the prefrontal cortex is when you get involved in all this what-if business. And there are tools that you can use to help a student begin to escalate down, to begin to calm down. Chapter 3 looks at the adolescent brain, and it's fascinating because the adolescents, as their brain reformulates after puberty, one of the things that happens is it's almost you have this theater. You've got what you see on the stage, i.e. students in school, et cetera, but behind the scenes, the brain is in this really developmental stage of figuring out social dominance. That's alpha male and queen bee. In other words, who's going to get the resources, the inclusion, the protection, social cognition, perspective taking, developing a moral code, and all of those things kind of come together. And interestingly enough, it's what we in schools really discourage and negate when it's really one of the most important things that the adolescent brain does. Chapter 4 looks at the hippocampus and the stories we tell of ourselves and how we keep coherent stories or not, and how that leads to emotional well-being. All of us, you, me, every human being, we don't create our stories by ourselves. They are created with co-authors, they're created culturally, and one of the things that we do is they're created intergenerationally, the stories that are told to us. And so this looks at how do you identify these stories a student has in their head, how do you help them develop coherent stories, and how do you teach and change behavior through stories. Then chapter 5 is the adults. Adults are stressed right now. And particularly during COVID, it is unbelievable stressors. And adult stress, one of the pieces of advice out there is learn how to cope with your stress. Actually, the research indicates that if you cope with your stress, you're actually increasing your stress. You have an app on your phone that actually tells you how much stress your body is under. And one of the things that we talk about is how do you begin to understand that and de-escalate it. It's interesting to me that we know that the brain has mirror neurons, and we know that emotions are contagious. And what happens is what happens in your classroom you feel. And you have a choice then about how you take it in. We'll look at the autonomic nervous system and ways that you can actually put more oxygen into your autonomic nervous system and calm your system down. And then in the last chapter, we're going to look at parenting. I personally think we approach parents kind of in a way that's not all that productive. Parenting is an emotional thing. It's not a cognitive, rational thing. People either parent the way they were parented or in reaction to their parenting, okay? And parenting is probably one of the most emotional things any human being can do. Those of you that have been parents, are parents, you understand what I'm saying. It's emotional. And so when you look at parenting from a brain-based emotional standpoint, there are strategies that can be used to get better outcomes. And we look at implicit bias, how both the educator and the parent brings in bias. For example, one of the most interesting things in bias are shoes and boots. One of them is educational level. One of them is race. One of them is cleanliness. So there's so many things that enter into bias. We'll look at institutional bias, how you then provide better strategies to have more effective parent-teacher conferences. And we'll look at tools for invitational language. How do you build relationships? So I'm so excited you're going to join me on this journey through this book, and I look forward to being with you.